Grace learned the weight of silence the night the house stopped feeling safe. Not because anything was broken, but because everything felt suspended, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, each second a reminder that time was moving even though her heart felt frozen. She sat at the edge of the bed, fingers wrapped around the hem of her cardigan, listening to the sound of water running in the bathroom. Elijah had been in there longer than usual, long enough for worry to creep in, uninvited and unwelcome. They hadn't argued, that was the strange part. No raised voices, no slammed doors, just days of careful conversations, cautious prayers, and an unspoken fear neither of them wanted to name. Grace stood and walked to the window. Outside, the street lamp cast a pale glow over the empty road. It reminded her of the early days of their marriage, how they used to stand here together, laughing, dreaming, praying boldly for a future that felt certain. Now, certainty felt like a luxury. The bathroom door finally opened. Elijah stepped out, his shoulders tense, his face etched with something heavier than exhaustion. "They called again," he said quietly. Grace turned to face him. "And?" He hesitated. That pause told her everything. "They're moving forward," he continued, "without me." Her chest tightened, not just with disappointment, but with something deeper, a question she had been trying not to ask. What happens to faith when obedience doesn't seem to work? Elijah sat on the bed, burying his face in his hands. "I did everything right, Grace. I prayed, I fasted, I obeyed, I trusted God." She moved toward him instinctively, kneeling in front of him, taking his hands in hers. They were cold. "I know," she whispered. "But it still fell apart," he said, his voice cracking, "and I don't understand why." Grace closed her eyes. This wasn't just about a lost opportunity. This was about identity, about calling, about the quiet fear that maybe, just maybe, God had been silent on purpose. She squeezed his hands. "Maybe this isn't the end of the promise," she said softly. "Maybe it's the beginning of a different obedience." Elijah looked at her then, really looked at her. His eyes were wet, searching. "What if I'm tired of being strong?" he asked. Grace swallowed. "Then I'll be strong for both of us, for now." They sat there together, the weight of disappointment pressing down on them. Outside, the night remained still. Inside, something unseen began to stir. Because what neither of them realized yet was this: the battle ahead would not be fought in public victories or loud miracles. It would be fought in forgiveness, in submission, in choosing covenant love when doubt whispered the loudest. And heaven was already watching. The days that followed moved slowly, as though time itself had grown cautious. Grace noticed it first in the little things. Elijah lingered in bed longer each morning. His prayers grew shorter. Sometimes they didn't come at all. He still went through the motions, devotions, church on Sundays, polite smiles for concerned friends, but something vital had gone quiet inside him. Grace didn't push. She had learned that grief needed space, even when it wore the disguise of strength. But late one evening, as she folded laundry in the living room, she heard it, a sharp exhale, a sound too heavy to ignore. She turned to see Elijah sitting on the couch, staring at his phone, his jaw clenched. "What is it?" she asked gently. "They posted it," he said without looking up. "Posted what?" "The announcement, the role, the vision, everything God told me to prepare for." He let out a bitter laugh, just with someone else's name. Grace set the laundry down slowly. She sat beside him, close enough to feel the tension radiating from his body. "I'm so sorry." He shook his head. "I don't want sympathy." She nodded. "Then what do you want?" Silence. Then, barely audible, "I want to know if any of it was real." The words sliced through her. She reached for his hand, but he pulled away. That hurt more than she expected. Later that night, Grace prayed alone, not because Elijah refused, but because she sensed this was a battle she had to stand in first. She kneeled at the side of the bed, her forehead pressed into the mattress, her voice barely a whisper. "Lord, guard his heart, Guard mine. Don't let disappointment turn into distance." As she prayed, a heaviness settled over the room, not the presence of God, but something else, subtle, oppressive. Spiritual warfare didn't always arrive with drama. Sometimes it came quietly, wearing discouragement like a cloak. The next morning, Elijah didn't come to church. Grace went alone. The sermon was about obedience, about Abraham leaving without knowing the destination. She tried to listen, but her thoughts kept drifting back to Elijah, to the way his faith had once burned bright, how he had led prayers with conviction and hope. When she returned home, she found him sitting in the dark, the curtains still drawn. "Hey," she said softly. He didn't respond. Grace sat beside him. "I missed you today." "I didn't feel like pretending." She swallowed. "You don't have to pretend with me." He finally turned to her. "Then stop acting like everything is fine." "I'm not," she said honestly. "I'm choosing faith." "There's a difference," he snapped, then immediately looked away, regret flashing across his face. "I didn't mean—" "It's okay," Grace said quickly, though her heart stung. "I know you're hurting." But that night, the distance between them felt wider than the bed. Grace lay awake long after Elijah fell asleep, staring at the ceiling. Is love enough when faith is shaken? She wondered. The answer came, not as words, but as resolve. Covenant isn't tested when things are easy. It's revealed when everything is uncertain. She turned toward him, laying a hand gently on his chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his heart. "God, teach me how to fight for him without fighting him." And heaven listened. Grace had spent the afternoon preparing Elijah's favorite meal. Not as a grand gesture, just a quiet offering, a reminder that love still lived here, even if faith felt fragile. When she set the plate in front of him, he barely glanced at it. "I'm not hungry," he said flatly. She froze for half a second, then nodded. "Okay, I'll wrap it up for later." But the silence that followed was sharp. "Elijah," she said carefully, "you haven't really eaten all day." He sighed heavily, pushing the plate away. "Why does everything have to be a lesson or a concern or a prayer with you?" The words struck deeper than he intended. Grace inhaled slowly. "I'm not trying to fix you." "That's exactly what it feels like," he snapped. "Like I'm some project you're managing with scripture and kindness." Her throat tightened. "I'm your wife," she said softly, "not your enemy." He stood abruptly, pacing the room. "You don't get it. I don't recognize myself anymore. And every time you look at me with that hope in your eyes, it reminds me of everything I've lost." The honesty stunned her. "I didn't lose you," she said. He stopped pacing, his back to her. "Not yet." The words hung in the air, dangerous and heavy. Grace felt tears burn, but she refused to let them spill. Not yet. Instead, she said the hardest thing she had said in a long time. "Then let me stay," she said, "even here, even like this." He turned slowly. "Why?" "Because covenant doesn't leave when things stop making sense." Elijah sank back onto the couch, suddenly exhausted. His anger deflated, replaced by something raw. "I'm so tired," he admitted. "I feel like God asked everything of me and then walked away." Grace crossed the room and knelt in front of him, resting her hands on his knees. "He didn't walk away," she said gently, "but I think the enemy is trying to convince you that he did." He looked at her sharply. "You think this is spiritual warfare?" "She knows it is," she said, "because it's attacking your identity, your calling, and our unity, and that's not random." Elijah lowered his head, his shoulders shaking. "I don't know how to forgive God," he whispered. Grace's heart broke open. She took his face in her hands. "Then start by letting him forgive you for being human." They sat there together, the room thick with emotion. That night, Grace didn't pray for breakthrough. She prayed for softness. "Lord," she whispered, lying awake beside Elijah, "don't let bitterness take root. Don't let disappointment harden what you designed to love." In the quiet, something shifted. Not resolution, but release. Elijah reached for her in his sleep, his hand finding hers, fingers intertwining as though instinct knew what pride could not admit. Grace closed her eyes. Forgiveness had begun, not loudly, not dramatically, but deeply, and that was enough for now. The invitation came on a Thursday morning. Grace stared at the email for a long moment before opening it again, as though reading it twice might change its weight. It was from the outreach ministry she had once served with, before life grew full, before marriage required more of her attention, before Elijah's dreams became the center of their shared prayers. They needed a coordinator, temporarily, they said, someone with experience, someone available. Grace closed her laptop slowly. Available. She wasn't sure she had ever felt less so. The role would require evenings, weekends, emotional energy she had been pouring entirely into her marriage. Her first instinct was no. Her second was fear. Her third, the one she recognized as the quiet nudge of the spirit, was obedience. That night, she mentioned it to Elijah as they cleared the cable. "I got an email today," she said casually, "from the outreach team." He stiffened slightly. "What about it?" "They're asking if I can step in for a few months." Elijah frowned. "Now?" "Yes." He shook his head. "Grace, we're barely holding things together. You can't add more to your plate." "I know, but I feel like God is asking me to." The room grew tense. "So God is asking you while I'm still trying to figure out if I can even hear him?" She swallowed. "This isn't about leaving you." "It feels like it," he replied. The words landed hard. Grace stepped closer. "Obedience doesn't always look like staying still." "And what if I need you here?" he asked, his voice rising. "What if I'm drowning?" Her eyes filled with tears. "Then I'll still be here, just not frozen in fear." That night, they prayed together for the first time in days. Not eloquently, not confidently, just honestly. "God," Elijah said quietly, "if this is from you, don't let it pull us apart." Grace added, "And if it's fear speaking, silence it." The next morning, Elijah awoke before Grace. He sat on the edge of the bed, watching her sleep, guilt heavy in his chest. She had carried him through his silence, through his anger, through his doubt, and now God was asking something of her. That afternoon, he surprised her. "If you still want to do it, you should do it," he said. Grace looked at him, stunned. "Are you sure?" "No," he admitted, "but I think obedience might be the very thing that reminds me God hasn't left us." She reached for him, tears slipping free. "Thank you." As Grace stepped into the role, something unexpected happened. Serving others began to heal her, and watching her obey without resentment, without self-righteousness, began to stir something in Elijah. He started opening his Bible again, slowly, carefully, like someone returning to a place they once loved but were afraid to trust. One evening, Grace came home exhausted. Elijah had dinner waiting. "I read something today," he said, handing her a folded piece of paper. It was underlined, messy, clearly wrestled with. "Those who sow in tears will reap with shouts of joy." Grace's breath caught. "Maybe," Elijah said quietly, "this season isn't punishment. Maybe it's planting." Grace smiled through tears. Faith hadn't fully returned, but it had woken up, and sometimes that was the miracle that came first. The call came just after midnight. Grace woke to the vibration of Elijah's phone on the nightstand. She watched him stir, groggy, before answering. "Hello?" She heard the shift immediately, the way his posture changed, the way silence fell heavy between his breaths. "I'll be there," he said finally. He hung up and sat there, unmoving. "What happened?" Grace asked, already sitting up. He swallowed. "My father collapsed. They're taking him to the hospital." The drive was quiet, the kind of quiet that hums with fear. At the hospital, fluorescent lights exposed everything: exhaustion, anxiety, unanswered prayers. Elijah's mother looked up when they entered, her face pale. "They don't know if he'll make it through the night." The words hit Elijah like a blow. Grace watched something inside him fracture. This wasn't just fear for his father, it was a confrontation with every buried question he had about God's goodness. They sat in the waiting room for hours. At some point, Grace bowed her head and began to pray silently. Elijah noticed. Something in him bristled. "How can you pray right now?" he whispered sharply. "Haven't we done enough of that?" Grace looked at him, not offended, not defensive. "This isn't bargaining," she said quietly. "This is surrender." He turned away, anger boiling beneath grief. In that moment, the battle became clear. The enemy wasn't after Elijah's father, it was after Elijah's faith. Later, alone in the hallway, Elijah broke. He leaned against the wall, fists clenched, breath ragged. "If you're there," he whispered harshly, "say something." Nothing. The silence felt cruel. And then, memory. A moment he hadn't thought about in years. His father, younger then, standing in their living room, Bible open, saying, "Faith isn't proved by answers, it's proved by trust." Elijah slid down the wall, tears finally coming. "I'm angry at you," he confessed, "and I don't know how to forgive you for that." The words felt dangerous and freeing. When he returned to the waiting room, Grace looked up. He sat beside her, voice low. "I don't know if I can pray, but I think I need to forgive God." Grace's eyes softened. He can handle that. They joined hands. No long prayers, no declarations, just this. "Lord," Elijah said, his voice trembling, "I don't understand you, but I don't want bitterness to be the loudest voice in my life." Grace added, "We choose trust, even here." Hours later, the doctor approached. "She's stable," she said. "It was close, but he's going to recover." Elijah exhaled, something deep loosening in his chest. Not because God had answered the way he wanted, but because faith had survived the fire. That night, as dawn crept through the hospital windows, Elijah realized something profound. Spiritual warfare doesn't always look like chaos. Sometimes it looks like an invitation to forgive, to trust, to believe again. And he had said yes. Elijah's father recovered slowly. There were follow-up appointments, medication schedules, and long conversations that stretched late into the night. But with every passing week, strength returned, not just to his body, but to the family as a whole. Elijah visited often, at first out of duty, then out of gratitude, and finally out of something deeper, reverence. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun sink behind the trees, his father spoke quietly. "I almost didn't make it," he said. Elijah nodded. "I know. But something happened," his father continued. "In that moment when everything went dark, I felt peace, not fear, peace." Elijah swallowed hard. "I think God used that moment to remind me of something," his father said, turning to him. "Faith isn't proven when life makes sense. It's proven when it doesn't." The words settled into Elijah's spirit like a seed finding fertile ground. That night, Elijah went home and found Grace in the kitchen, humming softly as she washed dishes. He wrapped his arms around her from behind. "I'm sorry," he said suddenly. She paused. "For what?" "For how I shut you out, for making you carry the weight of my doubt alone." She turned to face him, her eyes gentle. "You never carried it alone. I was right there." He shook his head. "You were carrying both of us." Grace smiled faintly. "That's what covenant does sometimes." They prayed together that night, not from desperation, but from alignment. Elijah felt it then. Not a rush, not a sign, just peace. Weeks later, Elijah received another email. This time, he didn't open it immediately. He prayed first. When he finally read it, his hands trembled. It wasn't the position he had lost. It was something better, different, aligned. An opportunity that used his gifts in ways he had never imagined, but perfectly matched the season he had been shaped for. He showed Grace. She laughed through tears. "God didn't forget you." "No," Elijah said slowly, "He prepared me." As life began to normalize, Grace stepped back from her temporary role, but the impact lingered. People reached out, lives were changed, seeds were planted. One woman hugged her tightly after a meeting. "Your obedience helped me trust God again." Grace went home that night overwhelmed. "Elijah," she whispered, "what if this was never just about us?" He nodded. "I think we were being shaped for something bigger." That realization didn't inflate them, it humbled them. Their marriage felt different now, not louder, not flashier, deeper. Forgiveness had softened edges, obedience had refined motives, prayer had become less about outcomes and more about presence. One evening, as they sat in the quiet of their living room, Elijah spoke. "I used to think faith meant certainty," he said. "Now I think it means surrender." Grace leaned into him. "And love?" He replied, "Choosing each other, even when fear is loud." They sat there, hands intertwined, hearts steady. The storm had passed, but the testimony was just beginning. Grace never planned to tell their story. She believed some things were too sacred to explain, meant to be lived, not displayed. But obedience has a way of asking again, softly, until it is answered. The invitation came during a small gathering at church. Nothing formal, just a circle of people, mismatched chairs, warm lighting, and quiet expectancy. The facilitator glanced at Grace. "Would you be willing to share?" Her heart thudded. She looked at Elijah. He nodded, not as permission, but as partnership. Grace took a breath. "There was a season," she began, "when I thought faith meant holding everything together, but God taught us that faith sometimes looks like letting go without walking away." The room grew still. She spoke of disappointment, of silence, of praying when answers didn't come, of choosing forgiveness before understanding, of obedience that felt costly and unseen. Elijah spoke too. "I thought doubt disqualified me," he said quietly, "but I learned that God doesn't abandon us in our questions, He meets us in them." People wept, not because the story was dramatic, but because it was honest. Afterward, a young couple approached them. "We're in that place right now," the woman said, eyes glistening, "trying to believe without feeling abandoned." Grace squeezed her hands. "You're not failing, you're becoming." Life continued. Ordinary days, work schedules, meals shared, laughter returned. But something had changed. Their prayers were no longer rehearsed. Their love was no longer fragile. Their obedience was no longer conditional. One evening, Elijah stood at the window, the same one where doubt had once whispered loudest. The street lamp glowed softly outside. "It feels different now," he said. Grace joined him. "What does?" "The quiet," he replied. "It doesn't feel empty anymore." She smiled. "That's because God stayed." They prayed together, thanking God not just for deliverance, but for refinement, for the season that pressed them, for the faith that matured, for the covenant that held. Their story never became famous, but it became faithful, and that was enough. Because some testimonies aren't meant to impress the world, they're meant to anchor hearts, and theirs did.